Is Jesus against or for the death penalty? What do you say? Would Jesus be okay for seeing people in certain circumstances be put to death because of their crimes? What about people who advocate for abortion? Is he okay with that? What about the death penalty in some countries? Would he be okay with that by the governments who have found someone guilty of a crime, which their law specifies the death penalty? Is Jesus against death and death penalties? That's the question we want to ask today. And I don't know if I have the exact answer you're going to want to hear or not, to be quite honest with you. But I'm just going to go through a couple of texts, Bible texts, that helps us maybe shed some light on this subject. When we think about the Old Testament, there was certainly areas in the Old Testament that one was put to death for committing crimes. And there's a whole list of crimes that could be committed where, or sins that God put up with the nation of Israel that would incur the death penalty. We see that in Jesus' life when he was on planet Earth, walking around under the Jewish Old Covenant, that at instances came to his attention where he was confronted with a death penalty. And so this was not unusual, right, to see such crimes in the Jewish arrangement, to see ones be put to death. But let's answer the question, is Jesus against death and death penalties? Let's see what Jesus says himself in John chapter 10, verse 10. He said, "The thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy." Now, what did Jesus come on planet Earth to do? He says, "I have come that they may have life, that they may have it more abundantly." When he's in heaven, his enemy is who? It's death. And of course Satan. But notice in 1 Corinthians 15:26 it says, "The last enemy that will be destroyed is death." So it's very clear Jesus' main mission is to get rid of and destroy death, because he has come to give life and give it more abundantly, according to his own words. The writer of Hebrews chapters 2 verse 14 says this, "Inasmuch that as the children have partaken of flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil." So who has the power of death, according to this text? And who is the only one that could remove this stronghold from him? Well, it's the devil. He has the power of death, not God. And Jesus came to get rid of that, to destroy him through his own death. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 25, it says, "But Jesus knew their thoughts and said to them, Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself will not stand." So if Jesus was for death and death penalties, then that would contradict his own statements about being there for life and giving life and not putting people to death. Yes, getting rid of death, but destroying people by death, is that part of his assignment as well? In Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 and 39, he says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also. You know, the advice I got when I was young, if someone slaps you in the face or hits you in the face, you don't back down. That's what the instructions I got when I was young. You don't back down. You don't resist that person. You fight back. Why? Because that person then, if you fight back, even if you lose the fight, they'll respect you. They'll leave you alone. They might even admire you or fear you. But a person that walks away, I mean, and that's what Jesus is saying to do. Walk away. Turn the other. Unusual, isn't it? If he was for death, killing someone, I mean, strike back. He's saying no. He's saying, you heard this, right? You heard this saying, don't do it, he's saying. Luke chapter 22, 50, 51. And one of them struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear, his right ear. This is Peter. Remember the night where Jesus was arrested. But Jesus answered and said, permit even this. And he touched the ear and healed him. So what did he do? He restored the guy's ear after one of his disciples had cut it off with a knife. What about this account? In Luke chapter 22, 23, 33, 34. And when they came to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him. And the criminals, one on the right and on the left, and one on the right and one on the left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And then they divided the garments and cast lots. I mean, even up to that point, is he interested in seeing people dying? I mean, Father, forgive them. These guys don't know what they're doing. They clearly, I mean, they killed me. They put me on here and by orders, I guess, from their officials, but forgive them. So is it in Jesus to see people dying? Does he want people to die? Okay, so let's have a look at what Jesus' will is as we look back at a couple of accounts, and we'll look at the Old Testament and some of the things in the New Testament. Certainly Jesus doesn't want people to sin, but he's not out trying to punish anybody. He's definitely trying to help people, and even those who are his disciples or those who are his brothers or those who are part of the body of Christ. He certainly tries to help us by tutoring us, discipling us, encouraging us to lean onto the Spirit, walk by the Spirit. He's doing all those things. Wants us to avoid sinning. But he's our advocate when we do sin and we turn around and we realize it was a mistake. You know, he's our advocate to the Father, right? So therefore, we can see he's not interested in us being punished. But let's see a couple of examples. Here's the law, Exodus 20:14. You shall not commit adultery is one of those, if we go back to the Old Testament now, right? So now we're going to see how the comparison from the Old Testament death penalties and Jesus Christ. The Leviticus 20:10 was the punishment. It says, the man who commits adultery with another man's wife, he who commits adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. Okay? Pretty clear. Now, we see this account, a precedent, if you like, in John chapter 8, 3-11. Let's have a read of that. While Jesus was on earth. So let's see his reaction to a woman caught in adultery, which would have meant by law, she committed adultery. 2, the punishment, according to Leviticus, was death. So let's read the account. in John chapter 8, 3 to 11. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in this very act. Now, Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? What do you say, Messiah? What do you say, teacher, rabbi? This they said, testing him that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. Verse 7. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. So he wasn't denying the crime. He wasn't trying to say, hey, she shouldn't be stoned to death according to the law. However, okay, now he's putting up a case for her. However, he who's without sin, go ahead. Again and again he stooped down in verse 8 and wrote on the ground. Then those who heard it began, convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. Verse 10. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? Powerful question. Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. Then Jesus said to her, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Now obviously the warning was there for her, but he wasn't condemning her for this act. However, he told her, don't sin. Obviously, because next time the crowd might just act on the punishment as prescribed in Leviticus chapter 20 verse 10, and she would die. So Jesus is against sin, such as this, adultery, or even dishonoring parents or stuff like that. However, death is his enemy. We've got to remember that. Like we read earlier in Corinthians, the last enemy of death in John chapter 10, where he said the thief does not come to except to steal, kill and destroy. He comes for life. He's not for death because death is his enemy. So he came what? To do what? To destroy Satan, who has the power of death. Remember we read that in Hebrews chapter 2 verse 14. It says that he himself likewise shared in the same, that through death he might destroy him who has the power of death, that is, the devil. So Satan has the power of death. Jesus and the Father, it seems to me, don't have this type of power of death, and Jesus refused to kill the adulteress according to the law. He didn't want to do that, so he worked around and still keeping within the bounds of the covenant, but reasoned with such people. Here's another one. Deuteronomy 6:1 to 5. Now, this is the law, what it says. Now, this is the commandment, and these are the statutes and judgments which the Lord your God has commanded to teach you, that you should observe them in the land which you are crossing over to possess. You shall love your God with your whole heart, with your whole soul, and with your whole strength. In Deuteronomy, the punishment, if you didn't do that, it says in Deuteronomy 28:45, moreover, all these curses shall come upon you and pursue you. That is all the curses laid out prior to verse 45. If they were disobedient, it says, all these curses shall come upon you, pursue you, overtake you, until you are destroyed, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord, and to keep his commandments and his statutes which he commanded you. Precedent. So that is the punishment, right? So if you don't keep the commandments, if you don't love the God, the Lord, with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your strength, then, and you do not, the punishment would be you would be destroyed, you would get the curses, because you did not obey the voice of the Lord your God to keep his commandments and his statutes, right? So this is important to understand. Here's a precedent in Luke chapter 9, verses 53 to 56. But they, the village of Samaritans, did not receive him, because his face set the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and to consume them, just as Elijah did? You know, remember Elijah and the priest, and how Elijah summoned fire to come down from heaven and burnt that sacrifice, and then 400 plus priests were slaughtered? Well, James and John, you know, they know the story. All these apostles know the story. Jesus knows the story, obviously, with Elijah. And so they're asking, Lord, do you want us? We'll do it. Let me. I'll do it. I'll command fire to come down from heaven and consume them. Well, I mean, it's in the Bible. It's in the Old Testament. I mean, it's law. It's punishment was meted out. It was approved in the past. Lord, surely you're the Lord. You're the Messiah. Let me do it. Let me see fire come down from heaven. And these Samaritans, I mean, really, they deserve this, right? Interesting what Jesus says. Verse 55. It says, just to recount Luke 9, 53 to 56. In verse 55, he says, But he turned and rebuked them and said, You do not know what manner of spirit you are of. You do not know. He rebuked them. Can you imagine? Whoa, hang on. What? What did we say? What? They would have been confused, right? But he says to them, You do not know what manner of spirit this is. For the Son of Man, notice, did not, I'll repeat, verse 56, for the Son of Man did not come to destroy men's lives, but to save them. Yeah, isn't that interesting? I just want you to let it sink in. Just as we might think, and we might let our minds go elsewhere, let's just focus and think about his words. Is he divided against himself in this area, or is he consistent? It seems to me he's very consistent, that he's not interested in punishing people and putting them to death. Here's another one regarding parents and honouring your father and your mother. Honour your father is one of the commandments in Exodus 20:12. Honour your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Punishment in Leviticus 29. For everyone who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. He has cursed his father and mother, his blood shall be upon them. So if we look at the other examples, what do you think we're seeing here? See, Jesus' interest is that parents be honoured, right? His will is not for someone to be put to death. Remember, death is his enemy. So Jesus came to destroy death, not to produce it. So where does that fit in? Well, it's a good question. It's an interesting response. Let's look at the response in Matthew 15, 3 to 6. Jesus answered to them, he said, Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? For God commanded, saying, honor your father and your mother. Remember, he's working within their framework, right? Honor your father and your mother. And then he says, and he who curses his father or mother, let him be put to death. So he's putting the law and the outcome in Leviticus. But you say, whoever says to his father or mother, whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God. So then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you see how the Jews were getting around these laws? So then he says, thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. These guys weren't even living up to the law themselves. Why? What was his emphasis here? What was he trying to emphasize with this question about honoring your father and your mother by law? He was saying that the traditions of men were hindering God's will from being done, such as the circumventing honoring their parents. By how? By giving money, right? By giving money as a gift to God. He was not emphasizing the death sentence, rather the neglect of God's will being done. You see? They didn't want to honor their parents. So they thought, how can we get around this? We don't want to, right? And we're not going to be put to death. Like, we're not going to be put to death because we're not honoring them. So how do we get around it? That is by some sort of bribery. We've got to remember, friends, the law was a shadow of heavenly things. The law wasn't God's will. It was like a distorted view, or not a clear picture of what actually the will was. Even the Apostle Paul said, when the Jews in 2 Corinthians, I think it is, when you look in the Old Testament, if you're an unbeliever and you look, or you're a person that you're not saved, you try to look into the Old Testament, you're not going to see a clear picture. And so those who were, because he said there was a veil covering their hearts and their eyes, right? So they couldn't actually see, spiritually speaking, what all this was about. It was only once that they became believers that their veil was removed and they could actually see what the law was about. And that's why he said elsewhere in Corinthians that the law was a curse, and other areas in Galatians 3:13, he called the law a curse. And he called it a ministry of condemnation and death. This is the law. As beautiful as it looked, it was a problem. It wasn't leading you to life. You can't get life by living under the law. You see? So that's why it was a shadow of heavenly things, not the reality. Jesus is the reality, friends. And Jesus is against death. This is his enemy. Number one enemy to Jesus is death. And who has the power over death is Satan, not God, not the kingdom of God, not Christ's kingdom. Otherwise it would be a divided kingdom, like Jesus said. That's the principle, right? So Jesus is against this, the curses, and he came to redeem us from it. He didn't redeem us from himself or the Father. And just to show that the law was a shadow of things, Hebrews 10:1 clearly says that the law having a shadow of the good things to come, right? Notice the good things to come, and not the very image of the things, can never with the same sacrifices which they offered continually year by year make those who approach perfect. It could never happen under the law. Colossians 2:16-18. So let no one judge you in food or in drink, or regarding a festival of a new moon or Sabbath, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. He's the reality. Let no one cheat you of your reward, taking delight in false humility and worship of angels, intruding into those things which has not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind. Hebrews 8, 4 and 5. For if he were on earth, he would not be a priest, since there are priests who offer the gifts according to the law, who serve the copy and shadow of the heavenly things, as Moses was divinely instructed when he was about to make the tabernacle. For he said, "See that you make all things according to the pattern shown you on the mountain." And Hebrews 9, 22, 23. This is just to show that the law was a copy, a shadow, wasn't the reality. We don't want to get bogged down with the law. It's not good for you. Hebrews 9, 22, 23. And according to the law, almost all things are purified with blood, and without shedding of the blood there is no remission. So Jehovah dealt with blood. He was a blood. It was the only way he can deal with sins was with blood. That was his way. And so this is why Christ's blood is the only way to be forgiven of sins, to be accepting Jesus and his blood, right? That's why it says, therefore, in verse 23, it was necessary that the copies of the things in the heavens should be purified with these, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Right? So, is Jesus for the death penalty? He certainly is against sinning, and he certainly is not in the business of putting people to death. We see that in numerous accounts there. He had the opportunity to, according to the Old Covenant, because in the Old Covenant, if you broke the word again and again, you would be punished. But in the New Covenant, God says, I will do this and that and keep his word forever. The Old Covenant is different to the New Covenant. Jesus was not about bringing about punishment. He was about bringing about God's grace. And God's grace was revealed through Jesus. And through Jesus, we see the Father's true heart, our Father in the heaven. God gave grace to the first man, Adam, and he called him a son. But Adam ran away, as it were, did the wrong thing. God gave grace to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but the children of Israel said, no thanks, we would rather go our own way, and they suffered because they had a conditional arrangement in the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant emphasized on rules will cause you to view God as a bookkeeper, recording all your sins and judge you according to your failures. But Jesus says God is not like that. Our Father is not like that. Our Heavenly Father loves you and holds nothing against you. He yearns for all of us, if we're a prodigal, to come home. So we are his children, and as such, and as we see clearly, even while Jesus was, ministering in the Old Covenant, not in the New Covenant, wasn't established as yet. He was dead set against death penalties and death itself. It's his enemy, it seems. So why would he put people into his enemy? It just does not make sense. Would you not agree? But look, these are just some thoughts. I'm not going to be dogmatic on this. Let me know what you think. Or at least have a think about it. Because that might shine a new light. And I'm not saying I'm introducing new light. It's in the scriptures, right? About God's grace. What it really is. And why have this a real good attitude, gratitude, when it comes to God's grace and the message of grace, that it's not about you and your works, but it's about him and what Jesus did. And it's accepting him, believing in him, and just receiving from him life, because that's what he wants to give. I want to give you life, but we need to accept Jesus and receive him, because we're receivers. And then we give through our life, right? Allow the fruits to grow, and then allow the light to shine through us. So if you find this message great, tick the box. This is what everyone's encouraging everyone to do. Tick, subscribe, like, tick, subscribe, like. The reason why they do that is because they want to go on top of the algorithms. I don't really push all that. Doesn't bother me too much. But if you want to do that, go ahead, guys. Talk to you soon. See you later.